You can't go wrong with a bit of good old high fantasy, a genre giving you the most extensive and sometimes complex lore, world building, and grand adventures throughout incredibly immersive fantasy lands. You have lots of it in literature, TTRPGs, TV, and also video games that take the highlights of high fantasy and immerse players in awe-striking gameplay, systems, and narrative design. Luckily, game designers are just as captivated and eager to get into a high fantasy game as you. Over the course of the industry, in a sea of games from various genres of survival horror, platformer, FPS, and just regular adventure, high fantasy has soared to great heights to stand out from the rest. You're the best of all time. Dragon's Dogma is Capcom's more medieval high fantasy spin on Monster Hunter from the studio behind its Devil May Cry games. While an immersive fantasy experience, the visuals and world design hold nothing special over competitors like Dragon Age, Demon's Souls, Elden Ring, and Baldur's Gate 3. Plus, there's also mixed feelings about the studio's handlings of microtransactions for the sequel. Nonetheless, the studio deserves praise in its own right for achieving a different vision with Dragon's Dogma than its standard long-running series like Resident Evil and Street Fighter. The creature combat, detailed character creation system, magic, and imaginative pawn companion mechanics are all fun. Just ask the Cyclops you knocked down to make yourself a bridge. It would be sacrilege to not put Square Enix anywhere when considering a list of best high fantasy games, the studio behind Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, and countless other gems. Although those two border more on science fiction, the developer's most traditional high fantasy project is the HD 2D pixel art adventure series Octopath Traveler. Both the original and the sequel are fantastic at demonstrating how state-of-the-art graphics and cinematics don't really matter in presenting beautifully realized fantasy landscapes and architecture and a solid story, which allows you to play through 8 different characters across 2 different fantasy locations. What's more high fantasy than J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth mythology and the Lord of the Rings series? Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor and its sequel Shadow of War. They're 2 excellent games that give you a new story within it, following a Blackgate ranger named Talion who's tethered to the wrath of Celebrimbor, an elf who you may know if you've seen the Prime Video prequel series Rings of Power. Talion has also faced Sauron and has a whole heap of orcs and their various commanders to dispatch or recruit using the game's patented Nemesis system where you can make your own orc army. Besides the elf, more familiar characters from the Lord of the Rings return, alongside a satisfying hack-and-slash combat with Batman Arkham-style counters and finishers. If From Software mastered the dark fantasy genre and gothic atmosphere with Bloodborne and Dark Souls, high fantasy was an even bigger triumph in Elden Ring. The lands between are not only home to lore and bosses crafted by fantasy author George R.R. Martin, but its regions come with one of the most enthralling art directions and use of colors in games of its kind. It's also one of the most accessible Soulsborne games from the studio on the more forgiving side when it comes to encounters, and offers tons of lore to discover to find out more about what the fantasy deal with the lands between and Tarnished really is. Getting the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC expansion will make the experience even more worth it. Is there anything more iconic than The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt? There are so many memorable story moments, side quests, and characters, not to mention your romance options. It's expansive and is the entry with the largest scope in the Witcher video game series, both in the locations you can explore and enemies you'll have to fight, as well as the narrative. Andrzej Sapkowski's mythology and vision come beautifully realized in The Witcher 3's gameplay, complemented by an exceptional performance by Geralt voice actor Doug Cockle. The combat animation, magic system, character design, story, and graphics, especially with the next-gen upgrade, make it one of the best fantasy epics in gaming. This game changed a lot of people's lives, and that's really all that needs to be said about Breath of the Wild. It took Nintendo's long-running series in a new and bold direction, featuring some of the most majestic art and open-world traversal. Not only is it one of the best Zelda games of all time, but it's also a runner-up for getting the title of one of the best Nintendo Switch games of all time, period. Even if you're not well-versed in the Legend of Zelda lore, that shouldn't stop you from enjoying this high fantasy experience, because the story is made to see that Link and Ganondorf are in this constant state of struggle through reincarnation. Its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, is a further testament to that end and expands on everything that made the original so highly acclaimed. Dragon Age was the show stealer in the realm of high fantasy RPGs before you had The Witcher 3 and even Skyrim. In total, there are 3 games: Origins, Dragon Age 2, and Inquisition. Each is great to try out if you want an original high fantasy experience that feels inspired by literature's greatest hits, though Inquisition is said to be the height of the series. Since Dragon Age is the brainchild of BioWare, a trailblazing developer and a master of the craft that paved the way for having more career options represented in the romance system, and a revolutionary dialogue wheel for branching decision-based paths, it's a perfect fantasy role-playing adventure for all genre lovers to dive into. When it comes to the MMORPG territory of high fantasy games, there's just nothing that can beat the juggernaut that is Blizzard's World of Warcraft. With all of its compelling expansions that have come out since the game's inception in 2004, you really can't say that another high fantasy game has as much dedication to its continued world building, storytelling, and lore as WoW. Azeroth is such a brilliant concept for hosting a high fantasy game world, an entire planet with fictional continents and lands brimming with lore, intriguing NPCs, and villains that are as well established as any you can meet in Game of Thrones. The land is made up of ruling houses like Proudmoore, Waycrest, Ashvane, and Stormstrong. With all the impressions and impact Baldur's Gate 3 had on the gaming community and its staggering achievement in game development and design, it should come to no surprise that it goes down in history as one of the best high fantasy experiences of all time, the entire series being built on the intricate characters and mythology from Dungeons & Dragons. The series began with BioWare adapting D&D into the digital RPG world of Baldur's Gate, before taking over 2 decades to find itself in the safe hands of Divinity developer Larian, which was a match made in heaven. You'll be lost in the sheer amount of things to tackle, careful attention to detail, NPCs to meet, gorgeous graphics and environments, and excellent act-structured pacing that results in endless replayability. As written, Bethesda's Elder Scrolls remains king of the high fantasy genre in games. Skyrim is still being actively modded today and widely discussed well over a decade since it was launched. What it achieved also shouldn't overshadow the earlier Elder Scrolls games like predecessors Morrowind and Oblivion, nor the equally wonderful MMORPG The Elder Scrolls Online. Anything Elder Scrolls means mounds of fantasy action adventure fun to be enjoyed. The world, characters, and classes work wonders for its medieval fantasy atmosphere that plays out in the first person, with Elder Scrolls Online further letting you engage with friends in multiplayer.